crossroads of dust. Wind didn't just blow at the crossroads. It whispered. Elias stood where the dirt paths met, his boots worn so thin he could feel the cold heartbeat of the earth. In his pocket, he clutched a single, dried-up seed, the last hope of a farm that had turned to dust. His stomach was a hollow cavern, and the memory of his daughter's hungry cries was a sharper blade than any cold. It's a heavy burden, being honest and poor, a voice remarked. Elias jumped. A man sat on a milestone that hadn't been there a moment before. He was dressed in silk the color of a bruised plum, looking entirely too clean for the barren wasteland of the valley. I'm not looking for trouble, Elias rasped, his voice cracking. I'm offering the opposite of trouble, Elias. I'm offering weight. The stranger stood, and as he moved, his own shadow stretched out behind him like a long, dark limb. I have more gold than the king, and you have something I collect. A trifle. Really. A silhouette. A bit of light blockage. Elias looked at his own shadow, cast long and jagged by the setting sun. It looked like him, tired, bent, and defeated. You want my shadow? For money? 10 bags of gold now. 100 more every full moon. You'll be the richest man in the land. Your daughter will eat from silver plates. Your wife will wear silk. The stranger held out a heavy leather pouch. The clink of coins was the most beautiful music Elias had ever heard. What happens to me without it? Elias whispered, his heart hammering. Nothing, the stranger smiled, showing teeth that were too white. You'll just be a bit lighter. Elias thought of the empty larder. He thought of the debt collectors. He reached out. As his fingers touched the cold leather of the bag, a searing pain ripped through his heels. He screamed as he felt something being peeled away from his skin, a spiritual skinning that left him gasping. The stranger stepped back, rolling up a dark, flickering shaved pan, tucking it into his vest. The sun was still out, but beneath Elias's feet, the ground was blank. There was only dust, no shape, no darkness. The first payment, the stranger said, vanishing into the twilight. Elias looked down, clutching the gold. He felt rich, but as he turned to walk home, he realized he felt something else. He felt thin, like a piece of paper caught in a gale. Elias had the gold, but as he walked into the light of his own home, he realized that a man without a shadow is a man who cannot truly stand in the sun. The weight of gold was real. Elias poured it onto the scarred wooden table, and the glow filled the dim shack. His wife, Martha, gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She didn't ask where it came from. The desperation in their lives was too thick for questions. We can buy the grain, she sobbed, clutching a gold sovereign. We can buy the medicine for Clara. Elias nodded, but he stayed in the corner, where the shadows of the rafters were thickest. He felt a strange, cold itch where his shadow used to be. It wasn't a physical itch, but a spiritual one, a phantom limb syndrome of the soul. Elias, come into the light, Martha said, her face blooming with a rare smile. Let me see you. He hesitated, then stepped toward the hearth fire. As the orange light hit him, Martha's smile died. She looked at the floor behind him. The firelight passed through the space where his shadow should have been, hitting the wall directly. Elias, she whispered, her voice trembling. Why isn't the light stopping at you? It's the soot. Elias lied, his voice sounding hollow, even to his own ears. The fire is tricking your eyes. Look at the gold, Martha. Look at the life we have now. But Martha wasn't looking at the gold. She was looking at the way her husband seemed a little more translucent than he had been an hour ago. When he reached out to touch her hand, she flinched. Not because she was afraid, but because his skin felt like cold mist. That night, Elias lay in bed, clutching the heavy bags of coins. The gold was heavy, but he felt like he was floating. Every time he closed his eyes, he felt himself drifting toward the ceiling, as if the gravity of the world no longer recognized him as a solid object. He was the richest man in the valley, and he was terrified. He had sold the only thing that anchored him to the earth, and the earth was starting to let him go. As the moon rose, Elias looked at his hand in the moonlight and realized he could see the floorboards right through his palm. The golden ghost. By the end of the first week, the farm was transformed. Men Elias used to beg for scraps were now bowing to him, their hats held low as they delivered fine cedar timber and crates of imported glass. Elias paid them in gold, and they took it greedily, though they whispered when his back was turned. He doesn't cast a reflection in the puddles, the carpenter muttered to the stonemason. And look at his feet, the mason replied, shivering. He doesn't leave footprints in the wet mud. It's like he's walking on the world, not in it. Elias heard them. His hearing had become unnaturally sharp, as if the thinning of his body allowed sound to pass through him more clearly. He retreated into his new manor, a sprawling stone beast built over the ruins of his shack. He draped the windows in heavy velvet. He hated the sun. The sun was a snitch. It told the world he was hollow. "Clara, come to Papa," Elias said one afternoon, sitting in a plush armchair. His daughter, now rosy-cheeked and dressed in lace, ran toward him, but as she reached for his knees, she stumbled. Her hands didn't hit solid bone and muscle. They slid off him as if he were made of silk and smoke. She looked up, her blue eyes wide with a primal, instinctual fear. "You feel like a cloud, Papa," she whispered. "You feel cold." Elias pulled his hands back, tucking them into his silk sleeves. He looked at his fingernails. They were turning a pale, pearlescent gray. He wasn't just losing his shadow. He was losing his density. The gold sat in chests around the room, millions of coins that weighed tons, yet he felt like he might blow away if a window were left open. That night, he tried to eat a steak cooked by his new chef. The meat tasted like ash. The wine felt like water. His body was rejecting the physical world because it was no longer entirely physical. He looked into the vanity mirror and saw the wall behind him clearly through his chest, where a heart should have been beating. The price of presence. Elias decided he needed more than gold. He needed a solution. He sent a carriage for the oldest physician in the province, a man who dealt in herbs and ancient lore. When the doctor arrived, Elias sat in a room lit only by a single, flickering candle. "I have a condition," Elias said, his voice sounding like dry leaves skittering across a floor. The doctor approached, his spectacles glinting. He moved the candle toward Elias. The flame didn't flicker as it passed him. There was no heat displacement. The doctor reached out to take Elias's pulse and gasped, dropping his bag. "There is no rhythm," the doctor whispered, his face ashen. "Master Elias, your blood is moving, but it has no weight. You are unraveling. Fix it," Elias hissed, shoving a handful of gold into the doctor's shaking hands. "Buy the rarest herbs. Perform the oldest rites. I am the richest man in this land." The doctor looked at the gold, then dropped it as if it were red-hot coal. "Gold cannot buy a soul's anchor, sir. A shadow is the tether between the spirit and the soul. Without it, the world forgets you. You are becoming a memory while you are still alive." Elias stood up, but he didn't feel his feet touch the floor. He felt the terrifying lightness in his gut, a buoyancy that made him want to scream. He looked at the doctor and saw the man's shadow thick, dark, and reassuringly solid on the floor. For a moment, a murderous envy flared in Elias's chest. He wanted to peel that shadow off the floor and stitch it to his own heels. "Get out!" Elias roared. As the doctor fled, Elias collapsed. Or rather, he drifted to the floor. He realized with a jolt of horror that he couldn't feel the texture of the rug. The world was becoming a ghost to him, just as he was becoming a ghost to the world. He went to the window and looked out at the crossroads in the distance. The moon was nearly full. The stranger would be returning for the next payment. Elias didn't want more gold. He wanted to beg for his darkness back, but deep down, he knew the stranger never gave her funds. The full moon's fifth night of the full moon arrived with a silver glare that felt like a spotlight on Elias's shame. He stood at the crossroads again, but this time he didn't walk. He floated, his boots barely scuffing the dirt, his body swaying with every breeze like a dandelion sea. The stranger was already there, leaning against a dead oak tree. He looked even more vibrant than before, his skin glowing with a healthy tan that Elias had lost weeks ago. Behind him, his shadow was massive, twitching with a life of its own. "You look light, Elias," the stranger chuckled. The sound was like gravel grinding together. "Has the gold not settled your stomach? Take it back," Elias rasped. He dropped a heavy sack of coins at the stranger's feet. The gold thudded, but Elias felt no relief. "I can't feel my daughter's hug. I can't taste the bread. Take the gold and give me back my shadow." The stranger leaned forward, his eyes turning into dark slits. "A contract is a covenant, farmer. I bought your shadow fair and square. You wanted to be the richest man in the land. You are. Why complain about the lack of gravity?" "I am fading," Elias screamed, but the sound was thin, like wind through a cracked window. "That is the nature of the trade," the stranger said, picking up the sack. "A shadow is the anchor. Without it, the soul has no reason to stay in the light. You are drifting into the gray, Elias, but don't worry. I have brought your second payment." He snapped his fingers, and 10 more bags appeared. Elias looked at them with pure loathing. They were beautiful, overflowing with minted sunlight, and they were utterly worthless to a man who was becoming a ghost. Is there no way to buy it back? Elias pleaded, his knees sinking not into the dirt, but through it. Only if you find someone to take your place, the stranger whispered, leaning in close. Elias could smell sulfur and old parchment. Find someone willing to trade their darkness for your gold. Then, and only then, will you be solid again. The stranger vanished, leaving Elias alone in the moonlight, looking at the gold and wondering whose soul he would have to murder to save his own. The merchant of misery Elias returned to his manor, but he no longer used the doors. He found that if he didn't concentrate, he could simply pass through the wood. It felt like walking through cold water. He sat in his counting room, surrounded by more gold than a kingdom could spend. He had an idea, cruel, desperate idea born of the stranger's hint. He called for his carriage and ordered his driver to take him to the slums of the nearest city. Why are we here, master? The driver asked, trembling. He kept his eyes fixed on the horses, afraid to look at the translucent man in the backseat. To find a volunteer, Elias murmured. He walked through the filth-strewn alleys of the rookery. Here, men died for a copper. Here, mothers wept over empty pots. Elias found a beggar huddled under a bridge, his ribs sticking out like a cage, his eyes dull with the coming of death. You, Elias said, looming over him. Do you want to be rich? Do you want to eat like a king for the rest of your days? The beggar looked up, squinting. He saw the gold. Elias held out a handful of coins that sparkled even in the gloom. But then the beggar looked down. He saw the torchlight from a nearby tavern passing through Elias as if he were a pane of glass. Where's your shadow, mate? The beggar whispered, pulling back into the mud. What does it matter? Elias snapped, his voice crackling with a ghostly static. Take the gold. Just give me your hand and say you'll trade your shade for my fortune. The beggar scrambled away, crossing himself. I may be starving, but I'm still a man. You're a hole in the world. I'd rather die in the dirt with my shadow than live in a palace as a haunt. Elias stood in the rain, but the water didn't soak his skin. It passed through his shoulders and pooled on the ground beneath him. He realized then that even the most desperate man knew the value of being real. As he turned to leave, Elias caught his reflection in a stagnant puddle. He didn't see a face anymore, just a faint, shimmering outline of a man who was rapidly becoming invisible. The Whispering Walls Manor was no longer a home. It was a mausoleum of gold. Elias moved through the halls like a draft of cold air. He no longer needed to open doors. They had become suggestions, mere shadows of wood that he drifted through without a sound. His servants had fled, terrified by the master who left no footprints and whose voice sounded like the scraping of dry bone on stone. Only Martha remained, though she lived in the far wing, clutching a crucifix and weeping. She couldn't bear to look at him. When he tried to sit at the dinner table, the chair didn't groan under his weight. He was a flicker of light, a glitch in the world's vision. Elias, she called out one night, her voice trembling through the heavy oak door he couldn't bring himself to pass. The gold. It's turning black. Elias looked at the chest in his study. He reached out a hand now so transparent, he could see the individual fibers of the rug through his palm and touched a coin. It didn't clink. It felt like a piece of frozen shadow. As he watched, the bright yellow luster bled away, replaced by a void-like darkness. The stranger hadn't just bought his shadow. He was solely replacing Elias's physical matter with the very currency he had craved. He wasn't just becoming a ghost. He was becoming a statue of cursed metal. He tried to scream, but his lungs were like old lace. No air moved through them. He realized with a jolt of terror that he no longer needed to breathe. The biological clock had stopped. He was suspended in a horrifying middle ground, too rich to die, and too hollow to live. He looked into the corner of the room and saw a dark shape moving. It wasn't a person. It was his own shadow, standing there, watching him with eyes that glowed like molten gold. The shadow's rebellion shadow didn't just stand there. It mocked him. It paced the room with a weight Elias no longer possessed. Every footfall of the shadow made the floorboards creak, a sound Elias would have given all his gold to produce himself. You like the gold, Elias? The shadow whispered. The voice was Elias's own, but deeper, richer, full of the life force that had been drained from him. Give it back, Elias wheezed. He tried to lunge at the dark silhouette, but he simply passed through it like smoke through a screen. He tumbled to the floor, feeling the terrifying lack of impact. He didn't bruise. He didn't bleed. He was just less. The shadow laughed, a vibrant, healthy sound. Why would I go back to being a flat thing on the dirt? I have the weight now. I have the hunger. I can feel the sun on my skin. even if my skin is made of night. The shadow walked to the window and touched the velvet curtains. Where Elias's touch did nothing, the shadow's fingers left creases. It was gaining physical agency. It was eating Elias's existence from the outside in. The stranger told me I could trade. Elias pleaded, hovering near the floor. I'll find someone else. Just let me stay until the next moon. The next moon is tonight, Elias, the shadow said, turning its faceless head toward him. And the stranger doesn't want more gold. He wants the vessel. You're almost empty. Once the last spark of your light goes out, I'll walk into your house, kiss your wife, and tuck your daughter into bed. And they will finally feel a hand that is solid. The horror of it struck Elias harder than any physical blow. He wasn't just losing his life. He was being replaced by his own darkness. His family wouldn't even know he was gone. They would just think he had finally returned to them. Elias looked at the clock. It was 5 minutes to midnight. He had one chance to reach the crossroads before the shadow became the man, and the man became nothing. The race of the formless Elias didn't run to the crossroads. He drifted, caught in the slipstream of a midnight gale. He was so light now that the wind treated him like a stray thought. He tumbled through the air, his limbs flailing with no resistance, passing through the branches of skeletal trees that should have scratched him. He felt nothing, no cold, no bark, no pain. Only the terrifying acceleration of a soul losing its grip on the earth. Behind him, his shadow followed. It didn't drift. It ran with heavy, rhythmic thuds that shook the frosted ground. It was gaining substance with every yard they covered. The shadow looked more like Elias than Elias did. It had the silhouette of his old shoulders, the tilt of his head, and a terrifying, solid strength. You can't outrun the dark, Elias. The shadow bellowed. The voice was vibrant, full of the air Elias could no longer draw into his own lungs. Elias reached the crossroads just as the moon hit its zenith. The stranger was there, sitting on the milestone, polishing a coin that seemed to suck the moonlight into its center. He looked up, his eyes twinkling with a cruel amusement. You're early, the stranger said, and you've brought company. I see your silhouette is eager to step into your shoes. Take it back, Elias wailed, his voice a thin whistle. He's going to take my family. He's going to live my life. The stranger shrugged, a slow, elegant movement. That was the fine print, my friend. A man is defined by his shadow. If the man becomes too thin, the shadow becomes the man. It's simple physics of the soul. Mass equals light times sacrifice. Elias looked at his hands. They were almost invisible now, to shimmering outlines in the silver light. The shadow reached the crossroads and stood tall, its feet planting firmly in the dirt. It reached out and grabbed the stranger's hand. The grip was solid. The stranger smiled. The trade is nearly complete, the stranger whispered. One more bag of gold, Elias, and you will be the richest nothing in the universe. The vault of the vanished stranger didn't hand Elias a bag this time. He pointed to a crack in the earth that hadn't been there before. It was a jagged tear in the soil, glowing with a dull, golden light. Go on, the stranger urged. Your fortune is waiting. All the gold I promised. It's all down there, stacked to the ceiling of the world. Elias felt a gravitational pull from the crack. It wasn't the pull of the earth. It was the pull of the gold. Because he was becoming the currency himself, he was being drawn to his own kind. He slid toward the abyss, his ghostly fingers clawing at the grass. But the grass passed through him like water. Martha. Clara. Elias cried out, but the names felt like ash in his mouth. He plummeted into the dark. He expected a crash, a bone-breaking impact. Instead, he landed softly on a mountain of coins. The vault was vast, an underground cathedral of greed. Thousands of shadows lined the walls, not flat shapes, but upright, flickering silhouettes of men and women who had stood at the crossroads before him. They were silent, their faces mere suggestions of grief. They clutched their gold, but they couldn't lift it. They were anchored to their wealth, trapped in a treasury where there was no sun, no wind, and no love. Elias looked up. Far above, the crack in the earth was closing. He saw the stranger looking down, and beside him stood the shadow that knew Elias. The shadow waved a solid, fleshy hand. It looked warm. It looked alive. Wait! Elias screamed, but the earth sealed shut with a final, heavy thud. He was alone in the dark with his riches. He picked up a gold coin, and for the first time in weeks, it had weight. But as he looked at it, he realized why. In the center of the coin, etched into the gold, was his own face, frozen in a scream of eternal regret. He wasn't just in the vault. He was becoming the vault. and every coin he touched added a year to his sentence of silence. The currency of Sice in the silence of the vault. Time didn't tick. It settled like dust. Elias sat upon his mountain of gold, the cold metal biting into his translucent skin. Around him, the other owners stood like statues. They were the shadows of kings, merchants, and desperate fathers, all holding on to the wealth they had traded their existence for. "Is anyone there?" Elias whispered. His voice didn't echo. The gold seemed to swallow the sound, dampening it into a dull thud. A figure shifted nearby. It was a woman, or the memory of one. Her gown was made of shimmering silver coins, and her eyes were to hollow pits of charcoal. She reached out a hand, and as her fingers brushed Elias's arm, he felt a jolt of pure, unadulterated grief. "We are the minted," she breathed. "We are the collateral for the stranger's bank. I want to go home." Elias sobbed, though no tears fell. His body was too dry for salt water. "I have the gold. I'll give it all back. I just want to see the sun." The woman let out a sound that might have been a laugh if she had a throat. "The sun is a debt we can never repay, little farmer. You sold your shadow, the only thing that proves you exist in the light. Down here, we only have the glow of the gold, and it is a cold, hungry light." Elias looked at the coins beneath him. They were beginning to pulse. Every few seconds, they emitted a low, rhythmic hum, the heartbeat of the world above. He pressed his ear to a gold bar and heard a faint, distorted sound. It was Clara's laughter. It sounded happy. Too happy, he realized with a jolt of horror that the new Elias, his shadow, wasn't just living his life. He was improving it, making his family forget the real Elias ever existed. The ghost in the glass back in the world of the living, the shadow Elias moved with a grace the original never possessed. He was strong, his skin was tanned, and his pockets were always full of real silver. Martha watched him from across the dinner table, a frown creasing her brow. "You seem different, Elias," she said softly. "Lighter, not like before, when you were fading, but different in your soul." The shadow smiled, and it was a perfect, practiced expression. "The wealth has settled my mind, Martha. I am finally the man you deserved." Deep beneath the floorboards, in the vault that shouldn't exist, the real Elias screamed. He had found a rift, a thin spot in the ceiling of his golden prison where the heartbeat was loudest. He clawed at the stone, his ghostly fingers whirring away into nothingness. "I'm here," he shrieked. "Martha, look down. I'm under your feet." But to Martha, the sound was nothing more than the house settling. To the shadow, however, it was a nuisance. The shadow Elias paused, his fork halfway to his mouth. He felt the vibration of the real man's despair. He leaned down and tapped the floor twice with his heavy, solid boot. It was a warning. "Stay in your grave," the gesture said. Elias slumped against the gold. He looked at his hands. They were now almost entirely made of gray smoke. He was losing the battle to remain a shape. If he didn't find a way to become heavy again, he would dissolve into the very air of the vault, becoming nothing more than the smell of old metal. He looked at the woman in the silver dress and saw her fading into a pile of coins. "How do we get out?" he demanded. "You don't," she whispered. "Unless you find a way to bleed." The alchemy of Agnelius stared at the woman in the silver dress. She dissolved into a pile of dull, gray coins. Her last sigh was the sound of a spent furnace. "Find a way to bleed," she had said. "But how does a ghost bleed? How does a man made of smoke and stolen promises find a drop of life in a tomb of metal?" He began to dig, not with his hands which passed through the gold like a breeze through tall grass, but with his will. He focused every ounce of his remaining memory on the feeling of a thorn prick, the sting of a nettle, the scrape of a plow. He needed a physical sensation so sharp it would force the universe to recognize his density. He found a coin that was different from the rest. It wasn't gold. It was jagged, rusted iron, buried deep at the base of the mountain. It was the first debt, the very first coin the stranger had ever collected. Elias gripped it. For the first time in weeks, he felt pain. The iron didn't just sit in his hand. It bit. It was cold, a freezing, cosmic cold that burned. Elias let out a ragged gasp. He squeezed the jagged edge into his palm, imagining the skin breaking, imagining the red warmth of his own life spilling out. "I am Elias," he whispered, his voice gaining a slight, gravelly edge. "I am a farmer. I have a wife. I have a daughter. I am real." A single, dark bead formed on his palm. It wasn't red. It was a shimmering, metallic black. It was the blood of a shadow seller. As the drop fell onto the mountain of gold, the vault groaned. The heartbeat from above grew deafening, a rhythmic thundering that shook the very foundations of the treasury. The gold beneath him began to liquefy, turning into a swirling whirlpool of molten metal that threatened to swallow him whole. The breach in the bedrock liquid gold rose to Elias's waist. It didn't burn like fire. It felt like being encased in heavy, cooling wax. He was being weighed down, anchored at last, but at the cost of being buried alive in his own fortune. Is this what you wanted? A voice boomed. The stranger appeared, standing on the surface of the golden tide, as if it were solid ground. He looked down at Elias with an expression of mild annoyance, like a gardener looking at a stubborn weed. You've managed to draw blood from a stone. Elias, impressive, but all you've done is make yourself heavy enough to sink. You'll never reach the surface. You're becoming a statue at the bottom of the sea. I am not finished, Elias gasped. The liquid gold was at his chest now. He looked up at the ceiling of the vault. Far above, he could see a tiny pinprick of light the underside of the floorboards in his manor. He could hear the shadow Elias singing a lullaby to Clara. It was a song Elias had written, a song that belonged to him. The rage that ignited in Elias's chest was hotter than any forge. He didn't want the gold. He didn't want the manor. He wanted his life back, even if it meant returning to the dust and the hunger. He reached out with his bleeding hand and grabbed the stranger's ankle. The stranger flinched. For the first time, his composure broke. Where Elias's black blood touched the stranger's silk sock, the fabric hissed and charred. Elias wasn't just a ghost anymore. He was a toxin. He was the regret of 1,000 sold souls concentrated into one man. Let me go, you wretch, the stranger hissed, kicking out. Take me up, Elias roared, his voice finally regaining its full, human thunder. Take me up, or I'll drag you down into your own bank. The vault began to collapse, the gold turning into a geyser of light that blasted upward, carrying Elias and the screaming stranger toward the world of the living. The upheaval of Earth Manor shook as if the earth itself were trying to vomit. In the grand dining room, the shadow Elias dropped his crystal glass. It shattered, the wine staining the white rug like a fresh wound. Martha screamed, clutching Clara to her chest as the floorboards buckled and groaned. It's just a tremor, my love, the shadow said, though his voice lacked its usual smooth confidence. His feet, once so solid, began to flicker. Suddenly, the floor exploded. A pillar of molten gold and blinding white light erupted from the cellar. It wasn't just metal. It was a physical manifestation of Elias's long-suppressed agony. Out of the center of the geyser, a hand reached out. It was gray, scarred, and dripping with black, metallic fluid. Elias dragged himself over the edge of the broken floor. He looked like a man carved from a thunderstorm, half visible, half smoke, and entirely terrifying. Beside him, the stranger tumbled out, his plum-colored suit scorched and his face twisted in a snarl. You've broken the bank, Elias, the stranger shrieked, scrambling to his feet. You've brought the gray into the light. You'll ruin us all. Elias didn't look at the stranger. He looked at the shadow standing by his wife. The shadow was staring back, his eyes widening with the realization that the original had returned from the deep. Papa, Clara whispered, her voice trembling. She looked from the shadow to the ghost on the floor. The shadow stepped forward, his fists clenching. I am your father, Clara. This is a demon, a trick of the light. Elias stood up, his body shimmering between being a man and a hole in the universe. I may be a ghost, he rasped, but a ghost remembers the smell of his daughter's hair. Do you, shadow? The mirror of truth shadow lunged. It was a collision of two things that shouldn't exist in the same space. There was no sound of bone hitting bone. Instead, there was a roar like two fires meeting. They tumbled across the room, a whirlwind of darkness and fading light. Martha retreated into the corner, shielding Clara's eyes. Elias, stop. Both of you. The stranger watched from the sidelines, his eyes darting toward the open door. He saw his chance to slip away, to find a new crossroads and a new fool. But Elias saw him too. Don't let him leave. Elias roared as he wrestled with his own silhouette. He has the contract. The shadow Elias pinned the real Elias against the wall. The shadow's face was shifting, losing its perfect features and becoming a terrifying, faceless void. Why do you want this life? The shadow hissed. You were starving. You were a failure. I have given them everything you couldn't. You gave them gold. Elias choked out, his fingers sinking into the shadow's neck. I gave them a heart, and even if it's a broken, hungry heart, it's mine. Elias reached into the shadow's chest not to kill, but to reclaim. He felt the coldness of his own stolen essence. He felt the weight of his own history. With a primal scream, he began to pull, the room filled with a high-pitched vibration that shattered every window in the manor. The curtains whipped in a wind that came from nowhere. Martha watched in horror as the two figures blurred into one, a chaotic dance of gray and black dots. Suddenly, the room went silent. A single figure stood in the center of the wreckage. He looked down at his feet. A shadow was there, but it was jagged, torn, and bleeding black ink onto the floor. The ragged Ruberthelia stood in the center of the ruined dining room. The silence was heavier than the gold had ever been. He looked down at his hands. They were solid again, but the skin was mapped with gray, marble-like veins. He felt the floor beneath his boots, but it felt distant, like he was standing on a layer of thick ice that might crack at any moment. He looked at the floor. His shadow was back, but it was a mangled thing. It didn't mimic his movements perfectly. It twitched, its edges frayed like a burned tapestry. It was a wounded animal, stitched back to his heels with the black thread of his own stubborn will. Elias. Martha's voice was a ghost of a sound. She stood 10 feet away, her arms wrapped tightly around Clara. He took a step toward them. The shadow on the floor dragged behind him, making a sound like sandpaper on stone. He reached out a hand, a real, fleshy hand, but as he did, the light from the broken chandelier passed through his fingertips for a split second before turning opaque again. "It's me, Martha," he croaked. His voice was thick with the dust of the vault. "Which one?" she whispered, her eyes darting to the black stains on the rug where the shadow had bled. "The man who sold us for gold, or the thing that lived in our house?" and smiled with his teeth. The question cut deeper than the stranger's contract. Elias realized that even though he had his body back, he had lost his place. He was a stranger in his own manor, a man who had died and crawled back into a life that had already moved on without him. He looked at the milestone in the garden through the shattered window. The stranger was gone, but he had left something behind. A small, golden quill and a fresh piece of parchment. The ledger of the lost Elias walked out into the night air. The wind felt like needles on his skin, a beautiful, agonizing pain that proved he was alive. He approached the milestone where the stranger had sat. The parchment was white as bone, and the ink in the quill was a swirling, oily purple. "The debt is not cancelled," the page read. "Only transferred." Elias felt a cold dread settle in his marrow. He looked back at the manor. The gold was still there, piled in the cellar, spilling out of the cracks in the floor. It was a curse he couldn't spend and a weight he couldn't discard. "You can't just leave it," a voice hissed from the darkness. Elias turned. The stranger wasn't there, but his voice seemed to come from the jagged shadow at Elias's feet. His own shadow was speaking to him. "The gold is part of us now, Elias," the shadow whispered, its faceless head tilting up from the dirt. "If you try to leave it, you'll become transparent again. You need the weight of that wealth to keep your atoms together. You're a gilded cage, and I'm the bird trapped inside." Elias realized the trap. He was solid only because he was anchored by the cursed gold. If he gave it away, he would drift. If he kept it, he would remain a monster. He looked at the manor the house built on, while Lion saw Martha looking at him through the window. She wasn't smiling. She was mourning the man he used to be. "I won't be your slave," Elias growled at his own feet. "Then start walking." The shadow laughed. "But remember, every step you take away from your gold, you'll feel yourself getting lighter. How many miles until you disappear forever?" Elias looked at the horizon. He had to choose: stay a wealthy ghost in a house of fear, or walk until he vanished into the wine. The burden of the Rodelius filled a small leather satchel with enough gold to make a man a lord, but to him, it felt like carrying a bag of leaden anchors. He stood at the edge of his property, the manor looming behind him like a silent, stone witness to his sins. Martha stood in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the warm glow of the hearth, a warmth Elias could no longer truly feel. "I have to go, Martha," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "If I stay, this house will swallow us both. The gold, it's a poison that needs a host." She didn't try to stop him. She saw the way his reflection in the hallway mirror flickered like a dying candle. She saw the way his shadow, that jagged, broken thing, seemed to pull at his heels, trying to drag him back into the cellar. "Don't come back until you're a whole man, Elias," she whispered. "Or don't come back at all." He turned and walked. Every step away from the massive horror in the vault made his chest feel hollower. By the time he reached the village limits, his vision began to blur. The trees looked like charcoal sketches. He looked at his hand. The gray veins were pulsing with a faint, golden light. The shadow at his feet began to whine. "You're killing us, Elias. Go back to the vault. Feed me the weight." "No." Elias groaned. Clutching the satchel, he found a beggar at the village gate, the same one who had refused him before. Elias reached into the bag and dropped a handful of coins into the man's lap. As the gold left Elias's hand, a terrifying sensation of buoyancy washed over him. His feet lifted an inch off the ground. He had to grab a fence post to keep from drifting into the sky. He realized the horrifying truth. To save his soul, he had to give the gold away, but every coin he gave made him less of a human and more of a ghost. The final bargain. Elias wandered for days, a shimmering, translucent figure draped in heavy rags. He gave the gold to the widowed, the sick, and the starving. With every act of charity, his body became more like mist. He was a walking contradiction, a saint who was vanishing because of his goodness. Finally, the satchel was empty. Elias stood on a high cliff overlooking the sea. He was so thin now that the sunlight passed through him entirely. He was nothing but a shimmer in the air, a ripple in the wind. Only his shadow remained dark and solid, a black stain on the white chalk of the cliff. Is this the end? Elias asked the air. It can be. The stranger's voice answered. He appeared at the edge of the cliff, looking bored. You've given it all away. You're a hero of the poor, Elias, and you're about to blow away like a dandelion sea. Was it worth it? Elias looked at his shadow. It was no longer a mangled thing. It had grown strong on the resentment of the journey. It looked ready to leap off his heels and take a life of its own. I want to be real, Elias whispered. Not rich, just real. There is one way, the stranger said, tapping his chin. A shadow is a debt. Gold is a debt. Life is a debt. To be real, you must pay with something that cannot be measured in coins. Give me your memory of Martha and Clara. Forget they ever existed, and I will give you back your weight. You will be a solid man, a farmer with a plow and a shadow, but you will never know why your heart feels like a hollowed-out gourd. Elias looked back toward his home, miles away. He could almost see the light in the window. He stood at the precipice. To exist as a man who remembers nothing, or to vanish as a ghost who loves everything. The shadow of the Sunalias looked the stranger in the eye. For the first time, he didn't feel fear. He felt a strange, cold peace. Keep your weight, Elias said, his voice a vibration in the atmosphere. And keep your memories. I choose the wine. The stranger's face contorted in a mask of fury. You fool. You'll be nothing. You'll be a sigh in a storm, but I will be his sigh. Elias replied. He stepped off the cliff, but he didn't fall. The wine caught his translucent form and carried him upward. As he rose, he looked down and saw his shadow screen. Without a body to anchor it, the shadow began to dissolve, its black ink scattering into the salt spray of the ocean. The contract, the gold, and the darkness were all tied to the shadow, and the shadow was tied to the earth. Elias was free. He drifted back across the fields, a gentle breeze that smelled of ozone and old dust. He reached the manor and passed through the walls one last time. He found Clara sleeping. He didn't have hands to touch her, but he brushed against her cheek like a warm draft. She smiled in her sleep and murmured, Papa. He found Martha by the fire. He couldn't speak, but he settled around her shoulders like a heavy shawl. She paused, a look of sudden, profound recognition crossing her face. She closed her eyes and leaned back into the invisible embrace. Elias wasn't a ghost. He wasn't a man. He was the protector of the house, the invisible weight that kept the family grounded. He stayed there, a shimmer in the corner of the room. A presence felt but never seen. The gold in the cellar turned to common lead that very night. The stranger never returned to the crossroads. For who can bargain with a man who has already given everything away? In the village, they still tell the story of the farmer of the wine, the man who lost his shadow to find his soul, and whose love was the only thing the devil couldn't buy.